So, this is a MediaMate, and it contains a bunch of files. So, this is a MediaMate, and it contains a bunch of 5 1/4 inch discs. There's a lot of classics in here, including Wolfenstein and Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, which inspired us later. And just behind that is the game, Karateka. Love it, it's so good.
I remember seeing Karateka and wanting it and then not have enough money to buy it. But I think I saved up some money and I eventually went back and got it. I was sold on the box artwork alone. Kind of told a story. I remember the illustration was really well done. And again, just kind of told a story of what that game was. And yeah, eventually I picked it up and started playing it.
When I first loaded it up, what I expected was something down the lines of Karate Champ or similar head-to-head beat-em-ups. Instead, what I got was a cinematic experience. That's what blew my mind, right? The fact that it started with, you know, a text crawl, right out of, which to my mind, that was right out of Star Wars, right? That cinematic experience is the thing that was just amazing, right? It was the most movie-like experience I'd ever had in a video game at that point.
It really felt like, you know, you're a karate hero in a movie. You know, that's fantastic. All the other things feel like bleeps and bloops, and this is like, you know, movie making. It was amazing.
Yeah, I was just very impressed by the fluidity of the animation. The kicks look great. The punches look great. They were always capped off with a little bit of a sound, a little kia. Yeah, the fluidity of the motion, I think, really set the stage for the rest of what I had consumed about that game.
The animation was cool, and that was very innovative, obviously, at the time. The process and the beginning of animation getting better and better, right? And more cinematic. Taking cues from the movie industry. But I think the story, I think the storytelling was probably one of the first. I can't think of another game at the time that had that element to it.
The characters were not little sets of pixels. They, in fact, were fully formed individuals. They had personalities. They had strengths and weaknesses. You've got to remember the level of graphics that people were doing at that time, and they were on the sophisticated side for that time.
Karateka was historically a very significant game, and it saw the future before anybody else did. Part of it was because it understood the language of cinema, that visuals mattered, that full motion mattered, that human beings and characters and characterization, and storytelling and music mattered in a way that we take for granted now when we see games. Games that are at least as complex as films.
You know, a common knock against a lot of game developers today is that they want to be movie makers. But gosh, you could almost look at Karateka as sort of the original apple from the tree of knowledge there. It was really, in a lot of ways, the first game that put together fluidity of motion, cinematic shots, story arc, twists, filmic language, and pointed the way towards a marriage of film, movie style storytelling and gameplay.
You actually got started when you kept going to the local arcade and you kept borrowing quarters to put in the arcade machine to do, what was it, not Star Wars.
Space Invaders?
No.
Asteroids?
Asteroids, yeah. You were completely addicted to asteroids. Every day you couldn't wait to go to the arcade to put some more quarters in that machine. To play asteroids.
And that was 1980, so by then I was already in high school. It's pretty embarrassing if I was borrowing quarters from you.
From everybody. Yeah. But I gave you the quarters, and then you decided you had to program your own asteroids. Why leave it to the arcade? And you said, I can do this on my computer. You were caricaturing when you were 9 years old.
The caricaturing, yeah.
But you did it because you wanted to use the money to buy an Apple computer.
The way I remember it, I was 12, 13 years old. I was doing the caricatures, I was doing the Cookie magazine, you had my Mad magazine parody. And really I wanted to do comics and animated films, but this was before computers came along. So I think if the Apple II hadn't been invented when it was, I probably would have just kept on making comics.
Okay, but I remember that you went to those street fairs, to those town fairs, to earn money to buy yourself an Apple computer.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know what the money was going to be for, but it was, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, but later on, you were definitely trying to save up I think you needed $900 to buy an Apple computer.
Yeah, $1,200.
$1,200.
That was the price of a 16K
So,
Apple II.
So to translate that into today's money, you can multiply maybe by 6. That's real money.
I know it was all the money I had.
Yeah.
And then even after doing the caricatures,
then you
I
borrowed
didn't
from
have
Emily
that.
to get for the last $100. You borrowed it from Emily. So then you started programming games. So the first one was Asteroids.
Asteroids was actually, I mean, it took a couple of years to get to that point because my first games were in BASIC. You know, there was a game called Breakout on the Apple II. It had colored blocks and you have a kind of a paddle. It's very simple. It's a ball bouncing and you try to knock out the blocks.
Yes, right.
And so I would look at these programs written in BASIC and try to deconstruct how they'd been done.
Mm-hmm.
And IBM had the Thomas J. Watson Research Center Explorers program. Once a week, my friend Adrian would drive me after high school to IBM, and they would let us kids come in and use the computers after hours. So that's where I first started learning how to program BASIC and APL.
I see.
And then with the Apple, it had BASIC, but it also had machine language, which was more of a mystery. It took longer to learn that.
Yeah. I remember that you did program Asteroids. You worked on that quite a while, and it was so good, such a good replica of Asteroids that that a New Jersey company bought it from you. They paid you a lot of money.
Well, maybe, I think it was $400.
That was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it was the first money that I'd earned by programming it.
Yeah.
And I was keeping track of it.
It was fabulous. And you had a royalty position, and you thought you would make a lot more money from the royalty. But then they got sued, and they had to stop the whole thing because it was too good a replica of Asteroids.
Yeah, that's right. That's almost exactly how it happened. The best-selling Apple game at that time was Space Invaders, and they sold, I don't know how many, but I figured out that if I could do that for Asteroids, that would be my ticket.
Yeah, and you were right. I mean, if they hadn't gotten sued, you would have.
If that'd been a year earlier, yeah. Right, that was just about the time that Atari kind of figured out what was going on, and they sent threatening letters to all of the new game publishers saying, you can't publish copies of our games. And the Asteroids never got
That was
published.
a big letdown.
Jordan was from a different world when I met him.
I don't think I ever heard a single college-related story from him. He was in a different world. I think college was just a place he lived. At least that's the impression that he gave.
What did you think about me making games? The fact that I was in college, but I was taking my computer with me and spending most of my time on these games.
You know, I always encouraged everything you wanted to do. I was indiscriminate.
That's right. I don't remember you ever trying to discourage me or telling me that I should focus on my studies.
In our family, that's what works best. People follow their passions, and that usually leads to a good result.
And so Jordan was this really, like his father played Go, his father played chess, just a very intellectual background, and yet Jordan was so into pop culture. Jordan loved all of the movies that had come out, Star Wars and Indiana Jones and all of those other movies, and also classics of cinema. So he was well versed in all of it. So he's this intellectual, like consummate intellectual, but is super into pop art forms as well. And I think Jordan managed to sort of gain control of his life, and everything else sort of fell away from that. His studies and everything, he started forgetting about.
I mean, I was getting pretty bad grades my freshman year. I was struggling. I had to drop a bunch of classes because I was spending all my time programming games. Did you even know that?
That didn't worry me, because I knew that was common among high achievers.
Same thing with Bill Gates, although I think Bill's departure from Harvard was involuntary. But a lot of these guys, they're just in too much of a hurry to get on with it and didn't want to spend any more time wasting their time.
did another one which was called Death Bounce, right?
Yeah, amazing. I'm amazed you can remember that. Yes, it was Death Bounce.
Death Bounce, yeah.
And it was kind of like Asteroids, but just different enough to be original. Instead of the asteroids, it was bouncing colored balls, like pool balls that ricocheted off the sides of the screen.
So what happened to that?
Well, that was the first game that I sent to Broderbund.
Oh yeah.
And I was in college. I was in my dorm room freshman year when the phone rang, and it was Doug Carlston, the president of Broderbund, saying, "Thanks for sending." That sent the game on a floppy disk, in the mail. That's how we did it then.
He was in college, and by his own admission, spending a lot more time learning to program than studying sociology or whatever it was he was majoring in down at Yale. He sent, I think his very first submission was something called Death Bounce. And I actually thought he was a pretty good coder, especially for somebody who obviously wasn't doing it full time. Although it turned out he was doing it a lot more full time than I realized.
And he said, it's well programmed, you're a good programmer, but this game is just a little bit old fashioned.
There was no plot, there was no story, there was nobody you cared about, there were just balls bouncing around doing different things. And although you could get away with that, I just thought it would be a much better product, not that particular one, but if he would try to come up with a storyline, a backstory for what he was doing. I did try to make it as much a not rejection as I could by telling him that I thought he was a keeper and he just needed to work on something that was a little bit different.
I got that phone call and he said, "I'm going to send you our new game, which is a big hit called Choplifter, so you can see what this year's games look like."
That was Danny Gorlin, and it was a straight submission. And initially there wasn't a game. He just was really interested in what it would take to make a joystick fly a helicopter on the screen. And then he added a little rescue thing, and we eventually, with him, turned it into a game.
And Choplifter was, you controlled a helicopter, and the idea was to rescue hostages.
Oh yeah.
It was kind of based on the Iran hostage crisis. And you had to fly your helicopter and rescue these little, 8-pixel high characters who are running around in the desert. It's a very simple game by today's standards, but what struck me about it was that it told a story.
That inspired you to think about Karateka?
Yeah, because when I saw Choplifter, it's like the state of the art of games had advanced. And that was kind of a revelation to me, because I realized that all the games that I'd been trying to make, Asteroids and Death Bounce, were really inspired by those coin-op arcade games, where you had 3 lives and you tried to rack up as many points as you could. But then with the home computers, games were sold on floppy disks, so you actually owned the game. So when I saw Choplifter, I realized that there's no need to make those kind of games, where people are going to keep playing to try to get a high score. A game can actually have an end. At the end of Choplifter, it doesn't say game over.
Yeah.
Put your quarter in, it says the end. And so that was new at the time, so that sort of was part of the inspiration for Karateka, to do a game that would also tell a story.
I was thinking about how Karateka got started. Do you remember how it got started?
So I was in college. It was my freshman year, I think, in college.
Yeah.
I probably came home on vacation.
Yeah.
At one point with this new project that was starting, and we were taking karate lessons at the local gym at Chappaqua. I remember that.
You were?
Well, Mom and Emily and I took some
that your
too.
mother and Emily were doing karate very vigorously.
Yeah, so I took karate lessons too that summer. I didn't get very good at it. I think I was a yellow belt or something like that.
Became a black belt.
Yeah.
So how did you come up with the idea of a villain and the prince and the princess? Where'd you get that from?
I think it was really Choplifter that gave me the idea that a game could tell a story. And then as to what the story was, since I knew that the gameplay would be a series of karate battles, it was really, I just turned to the Bruce Lee movies.
Bruce Lee.
The simplest kind of story. It's always a series of karate battles leading up to the battle with the...
And the drama was where there's a problem and the hero has to solve it. Liberate a princess or...
I was trying to give it human interest.
Yeah. Just wondered what the model for that was.
I mean, Disney was an influence for sure. I'm thinking of films like Snow White or Pinocchio, where you always had this sort of scary villain who would, capture one of the characters. Or the Wizard of Oz, you had the Wicked Witch of the West, you had Dorothy trapped in the witch's castle. You know, with Dorothy even had an hourglass. You know, like, I'm sure that was part of the inspiration for Prince of Persia.
Ah, so then how long did you work on Karateka?
It was a couple of years. Do you remember seeing like the first version?
Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, I saw everything.
Yeah, you saw it evolve.
I saw it evolve. Yeah, I remember that. I remember telling you that there were great props available if you used the Japanese theme. That you could use a Shinto gate and Mount Fuji in the background. Remember that?
Was that your idea?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, sure. Because you didn't know what those things were.
Oh, I mean, we had the prints of the wave breaking on Mount Fuji.
Yes.
We had those books
yes,
of
you-
Hokusai prints,
That's
of
right,
Shiraku
yeah.
prints. And I think you brought those back from a trip you made to Japan in the 60s, right? Because growing up, I mean, we had a Goban.
Yes.
And we,
Yeah, I bought back the Go sets and the Go Ban. But anyway, I remember telling you about the Shinto gate. And then we looked it up. We looked because I didn't remember exactly what the boards looked like. So we looked it up and found a picture of one in the middle of the water. Remember?
Yeah.
The ocean. I said, that's what it should look like. And you said, okay, and you did it right away.
I remember drawing that gate in perspective.
Yeah.
And when it scrolled onto the screen, because it was so big, it slowed down the animation. But it was worth it. And then Mount Fuji was always visible in the background.
Yes.
It was kind of an illusion of animation because you couldn't really do scrolling on the Apple II. But there was this gate that had repeating, a post.
Yes.
So it was really just one, a few bytes
So
of graphics.
Fuji was a static prop.
Right, and the posts were like a mask over it. When they moved, it kind of gave the illusion that the whole camera was
Right.
scrolling, even though really there was almost nothing on the screen that was animated.
Working with Jordan was fascinating because he brought in the cinematic side. He obviously was really into movies. He's actually gone off and worked for a bit in the film industry. And the aesthetic and the motion of Karateka, which he continued in Prince of Persia and later in The Last Express, was really unusual for the time, this idea of rotoscoping.
I decided to try a trick early Disney animators had used called rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is basically filming live actors doing the moves that you want to animate, and then literally tracing each frame to get a frame of animation. At first I started to try to do the animation the usual way by drawing characters on graph paper. And then, because it was pixel by pixel at that time that we had to do the animations. But when I tried it, it just looked stiff. And I think you were the one who had the idea of filming the movements and then counting the number of frames.
I suggested, when I saw you struggling with these pixels, I suggested that we just make a video.
Well, not video. This was 1982.
A Super 8, a Super 8 of somebody actually making those movements. I thought, I didn't remember that. Like you're right.
And you were actually a model at one point, because I started by filming our karate teacher, Dennis, doing the punches and the kicks, advancing and retreating. But then later on, I realized that the character would need to run, like that it was too slow to move in that karate stance throughout the entire palace. So I needed someone running. And so you put on a karate outfit, and we went out into the woods in front of the house in Chappaqua, and I filmed you running in Super 8. And also the climbing up onto the cliff at the beginning of the game, that was you, climbing up onto the hood of the car in the carport.
I've forgotten that.
We're wearing, I guess, I don't know if it was my karate suit or...
Mom's probably.
Yeah, you were probably wearing Mom's gi.
Yeah.
And you had never taken karate lessons, but you did the running. Yeah, so what I did was I put that Super 8 roll of film on the Moviola, which was it was a screen with a rear projection, and you could turn the crank and stop on a particular frame, and then I would put a piece of tracing paper, I would scotch tape it to the screen and trace the outline of the character with a pencil, and then wind it a couple of frames ahead and then do the same thing. So I ended up with all these little sheets of tracing paper with outlines.
That was a breakthrough actually in video game technology, because nobody had done that before you.
I mean, it really goes all the way back to silent film. I mean, I found out later that the early animators had done this. In Snow White, Disney's animators had actually, not for the dwarfs and the animals, but for Snow White and the prince, the more human characters.
It's kind of an obvious idea, because everybody knows that real live movements are totally different from what a cartoonist would draw. I mean, there are very subtle rhythms and speed changes that define a human movement, a movement of a live organism as opposed to the movement of an imagined organism.
Well, and also there's so many complexities, like there's things that you wouldn't imagine, like the way that you kind of throw an arm awkwardly over one shoulder to compensate for the change in balance.
Correct.
It's like when you see it, it looks natural, but if you're just trying to reconstruct in your head what someone does, for example, when they turn around while running, you wouldn't think of that.
And also we make adjustments of the angle at which we hold the body depending on the speed with which we're moving, so that we don't tilt over. And those adjustments are very critical to the realism of the movement.
Yeah, in Karateka it's very subtle, but there's a low kick, a middle kick, and a high kick.
I know.
And I remember the frame of the high kick, the fighter leans back, and also the arm goes back, and that's something, I remember that because I had to draw that frame and use it so many times. For 2 years I was staring at that frame. But in the beginning, when I tried to do a frame of a high kick, it was more like idealized.
Yeah.
You didn't realize that the body would have to lean quite that far back.
That's fascinating.
This took a very long time. It was an incredibly laborious process. It took me months to go through all these steps just to get to the point of doing the first animation test. But I can still remember the thrill that I felt on seeing that little figure moving across the screen. It was the illusion of life. It was everything I'd hoped for. This is the apartment where we made the music 35 years ago, right?
Right. And I sat right here.
Right. It was.
You sat. Where did you sit? There or here?
Well, I don't remember. It's been 35
But
years.
you had your laptop.
It wasn't a
It
laptop.
wasn't a laptop.
Yeah.
It was a computer. What was it? An
It
Apple.
was an Apple II computer.
The music that was there just in the Apple II was fantastic, and it just sort of like gave you a sense of, like sort of a score, happening during your game, and it was one of the most impactful as far as just remembering it as a total experience of a game that I've had in a long time.
I remember with Karateka the music, and there wasn't a whole lot of it in the game, but there were a few tunes that played at key moments, and I remember the opening music had a big impact. And it was interesting with the Apple IIc because it was a single unit and there was a speaker built into it. And so when you put your hands on the keyboard, if you had the volume really loud, you can feel the vibration of the music being played through the speaker. And Karateka, for some reason, I remember that opening tune. I haven't heard it in I don't know how long, but I'm sure if I heard it, I would recognize it immediately. But I just remember the music having a big deal.
I knew from early Disney animation and silent movies how important music was to tell a story and make it emotional. But I wasn't a musician. So I turned to my dad. He was a businessman, not a professional musician, but he was a really good classical pianist.
Yeah, that's what I grew up hearing. So Karateka was your first composing job.
Yeah.
And not all games had music at that time. It was, technically it was difficult to get music into the game because the Apple II processor could only do one thing at a time.
Yes.
So anytime we played music, the action on the screen had to freeze. For example, we couldn't play the music while the princess was walking.
Right.
So we had to design it in such a way that the characters would pause, then we would play a little bit of music, then we could animate. But it was worth it because the music added drama.
Even the idea of using music in a video game was novel at that time. I even observed to you that none of these games use music. They have clicks, and they have loud clicks and soft clicks, and sometimes they had beeps, but they never had music.
Yeah, that's right. On the Apple, it had a speaker that could only do beeps.
We had that conversation. Can these beeps be turned into music? And then you explained to me that every beep had a range of frequencies and could be tuned to any particular frequency. So I said, well, why not have a series of beeps that are tuned to notes?
Yeah.
And then you have music.
Of course, when he agreed to compose the music for Karateka, I'm not sure he really understood just how severe the technical limitations of the Apple II were. This was before sound cards.
There is one memory location that if you accessed it, it would go. And that's what you had to make sound with. That's how you made sound effects, that's how you made music. You just did that faster or slower.
He'd write out the themes for Mariko and the hero and Akuma on sheet music, and I'd calculate the hexadecimal note values and type them into the computer. I remember playing the music back for him, and he'd say, well, this note here it's a little bit sharp, and I'd bring it down one, and he'd say, well, now it's a half tone too flat, and so I'd bring it up one, and then he'd say, well, now it's a quarter tone sharp, and I'd say, Dad, this is a computer. It's a number from 0 to 255. There's nothing in between.
I was trying to remember, how did we talk about what kind of music to write? Were there any?
Oh, I immediately said that you need a leitmotif, of course. That was a no-brainer. I mean, that was clear right away.
He suggested using Wagner's leitmotif approach, also used in movies like Star Wars, in which each character is represented by a musical theme.
Yeah.
So I thought, I was thinking of the Siegfried motif in Wagner's Götterdämmerung series. The Siegfried opera has a leitmotif for Siegfried, who is a hero, sort of an admirable figure. And I wanted that for your hero in Karateka. So I was thinking that the Siegfried motif goes something like this. It goes. And then it goes in. Like that.
Yeah.
So it was too long. It had to be short for Karateka. So I tried to abbreviate it. Like that.
Yeah, except that I couldn't play notes simultaneously.
Yeah, but okay, but like that. So that's sort of a takeoff on the Siegfried theme.
It always sounded great when you played it on the piano, but then when I translated it to the Apple II,
Well,
it was...
it sounded pretty good, actually. And then we did the Akuma theme. It has to be sort of a menacing.
Yeah, making you play this for the first time in 35 years.
Mm-hmm. And then the danger theme, which is sort of related to Akuma. So we used this.
I mean, that sounds like Wagner to me too. Was that inspired by Hunding's theme? And
Yeah, exactly. The Hunding theme, right. Forgot that. And then the princess is.
I thought the music was played at the right moments. Like it was all set up very dramatically, you know, to play on the story that I think was being implied. And, you know, to me, it sort of was a precursor to all the stuff that came later.
But yeah, for Karateka, we had the hero's theme, and then the villain Akuma's theme, and then the princess's theme.
Right.
Just very strong flavors.
Yeah, but you know, what you're reminding me of is how new that idea was at that time. You know, the very idea, the very possibility of having music in a video game, where there are no notes available, where you can only have one beep at a time. It's not obvious that can be turned into music, you know.
And it was important for creating the mood. When you have a character sort of 40 pixels high, you don't have camera angles, you don't have lighting, but you want to show that this one is the villain, and you know, this one is the princess in distress. You know, the music, just like, even if it's just a few notes and you don't really have orchestration,
Right.
it tells you right away who's who.
So it's amazing what we accomplished with that, you know, really.
Hello, noble warriors. Kirk Hamilton here. I host a music podcast called Strong Songs, and I'm here today to break down the music, the very strong music, for a very important video game. This music, composed by the great Francis Mechner, wound up setting the template for a lot of video game music that would come in the decades after it, but this game was one of the first. Of course, the music I'm talking about is the music for the game that you are all now playing, Jordan Mechner's 1984 martial arts adventure, Karateka. Karateka may seem like a simple game when you look at it, and compared to most modern video games it is, but it was actually at the vanguard of a lot of pretty cool things, particularly with regard to narrative. You play as a lone hero trying to rescue
We probably had, in a 3-year period, 7 or 8 games that got in the top 10 on the bestseller charts. Choplifter was certainly one. I think Lode Runner was another. Apple Galaxy and Alien Rain was 2. Snoggle was. I suspect there were a few others. I was always worried that there was going to be a dip in the number of really good submissions, and that if we didn't work harder to bring them in, we were going to find it very hard to grow. It was our effort to build an internal group that gave us some stability and also some quantity of submissions. We decided that because we're having so much trouble getting engineers to come up with great ideas, that maybe we should separate the two. The fact that you can code doesn't mean that you can be effective in thinking of what to code. And some of our very best coders would complain to me they never had a creative idea in their lives. Somebody had to tell them what to do. So Gene and Lauren were brought in to do exactly that.
I was an architect. I was moved to Sonoma County as an architect, and I had begun playing some of the games. At one point, I just drew up a number of games that I thought would be fun, and I just drove down to San Rafael and walked in the front door with no introduction and talked to the brothers, talked to Doug and Gary Carlson. Over one lunch, they looked at the drawings and said if I could convince the programmers to do some games for the drawings I had, I was welcome to join. And that was the end of that. I just walked in, and I had to find my own desk and find a computer and do everything else. I just wandered around. In fact, it was it was a liquor warehouse in San Rafael, and Gene was stuck in an airless room with a door. I don't know what they stored in there. But I just wandered around. There was a desk in there, and I wandered in and asked if it was okay if I sat there. And he said, sure. And we started working together from that day on, but it was pure happenstance.
Gene had worked for Imagineering down at Disney. He said he'd done 5,000 illustrations of Jiminy Cricket and so on.
He worked back in an era when they drew the cells one at a time, right? A hand-drawn every animation cell. So he really knew that industry, and he knew Disney spent a lot of time getting the idea of a character, the sense of a character, obviously, in the movies. And that was something that the software industry did not have. It really did not have. So one of the first things that a couple of games we first worked on together, Choplifter, which was a Dan Gorland's game, Gene would always stress that you had to get a sense of the figure, but Gene spent his time talking to everybody about how you could draw that character and just give him enough animation to make sense that he was alive, that he was a real character and would walk across, get impatient and walk across the screen, or get pissed off and leave the screen or whatever. And he started doing that even before Jordan got there, but we worked on a number of things so that's what his sense was. His sense was bringing life, bringing a real character, bringing a real, real stories to the characters. They would throw them in what became known as the rubber room. They would throw them in the room with Gene and myself, and we just BS about the game, add things if we wanted to. It was all at the designers like Jordan's. It was at his, he made all the decisions on it, but we would spend a lot of time on drawing things and talk about animation and everything else. But yes, I generally knew all internal games and external ones that they eventually published came through the rubber room at some point.
Okay, so let me ask you something. It's because from high school through college, basically, I was making these games, and I had the ambition of making a game that would be good enough to get published.
Right.
But that never really happened. It didn't happen with Asteroids. It didn't happen with Death Bounce. And then Karateka was the one that finally did. So I sent Berterbund Karateka on floppy disk, and they said, "This is great. We want to publish it."
It was essentially a finished game. At least it had all the pieces together. I think he wanted to keep the whole thing under wraps and see if he could get it exactly right without any nudging or criticism or whatever. And I have no idea whether he was that self-confident or that unself-confident. I don't know whether he was doing that because he was sure he could do it all on his own, or whether he didn't want to get another refusal.
Yeah, I went to Berterbund in 1984, the summer between my junior and senior years. At that time, I'd mostly finished Karateka. I'd sent it to Berterbund on a floppy disk. They'd said they wanted to publish it, but that they wanted me to do some more work on it. and they actually flew me out there for the summer to add
Right,
to add a second and a third level.
Right.
Well, we knew it was going to be publishable. You know, there was enough there to know that even if it needed lengthening or, you know, a little more of an experience for the player, there wasn't any doubt that it was going to be publishable.
I remember, because we used to have pitch days, I remember seeing it then. I remember when it was brought in, because a lot of times they would bring things in, and I think we would, on Friday afternoons, ideas would come in and everybody take a look at them. And I know Gene was enthralled with just the animation part of it, you know, but Jordan had a real a real interest in movies. I mean, and had taken a lot of inspiration from that. And he and Gene were very similar in that, right? They were both hardcore kind of movie people, and Gene knew all of the movies that Jordan would ever talk about. So I think they shared a real sense of it was automatic. It was really easy for him, a real sense of the storytelling. But anyway, doing all the filming and then having rotoscoping, you know, having it drawn. And Gene, of course, had spent 20 years doing that, right? Effectively, just doing it by hand. And so he could tell, he could talk about the frames you could skip, you know, how to exaggerate, you know, how to take the rotoscoping, but exaggerate it a bit. Don't do it literally there, you know, all the falls and all the lunges and all that stuff, you know, okay, just tweak that a bit, you know, just because you're, you know, it's an emotional experience rather than just a cinematic one entirely. So those were really easy conversations to have. So those two, I think, had a good time talking about it. I was learning how to draw all that stuff and do the animation with Gene on it, and he was a great teacher on it. I tended to be more precise, and Gene tended to be more exaggerated. He tended to have lots of, you know, land and squish kind of things, you know, where balloons would, you know, how they land and flow out. So the leopard was easy, I think, probably because I was more exact about it. And the idea that you could actually get one of these things in a game was just wonderful, because I didn't get that much of a chance to do that. I think Gene would probably start with a sketch and I would look at it, and then you just did it pixel by pixel. That's all there was to it. There weren't any fancy big monitors. There wasn't a whole lot of previewing all the frames at different speeds or anything like that. So from a sketch, draw it very carefully by hand, and just repeat the process. It's just a very tedious, slow, pixel at a time process, but fun. I enjoyed every minute of it.
And first programmer.
I am Francis Mechner, Jordan's father, and the composer of the music.
Yeah, this was the fastest scrolling that I could manage on the Apple II. The Apple II didn't have things like scrolling built in, so we actually had to copy each line of pixels, erase it, and then redraw it one line higher and try to make that look smooth.
I remember the first time reading that, I realized that this game was going to be a success.
I would have loved to make it scroll in 3D like Star Wars.
Karateka.
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 Karateka?
Karateka.
Karateka.
Karateka, and if it's Karateka, I've never heard that before. So maybe Jordan says it that way. I don't know, but I know we all said Karateka at the company.
I think when I was a kid, I always said Karateka, Because it's like you say karate and you just add the k.
Let's talk about pronunciation. So here's the thing. In the 80s, TV didn't talk about games, and we didn't have the internet, so pretty much everybody pronounced the title of the game in their own way. A lot of people say karateka or karateka. In Japanese, there's no stress on any syllable, so it would be karateka, something like that. I called it karateka, but I've since found out that pretty much everybody pronounced it differently. So however you pronounce it is fine. Don't feel bad. It's all good.
So I met Jordan, it's probably like 1984, it must have been. So I had moved up from Southern California to Northern California. Doug Carlston, the CEO of Broderbund, invited me up. I think originally I was living at his house. And then I ended up, Jordan was visiting from college and I met him and we hit it off. We're very different, right? He's from just outside of New York City. His dad is this sort of, European intellectual. My family is very much Californian, so it was kind of this mixed thing. But he was, of course, fascinated with LA culture because he loved movies. And I had this sort of exotic blonde hair, tall, like volleyball player look. So it was kind of opposites attract. And then we ended up rooming together in San Rafael. And, we were kind of inseparable for a while. And he was, well into Karateka, and we just became good friends, and then I was free, and then they needed a conversion, he just asked me to do it. So Karateka came out and did very well on the Apple II. And the conversions, so the Commodore 64 was kind of a hot computer at that point. And the Atari was a little bit older and maybe not quite as popular, but it still was a viable platform. And a conversion, particularly from Apple to the Commodore 64 and Atari, they had the same microprocessor, or roughly the same, but they ran the same code. And so the ports didn't take that long to do. So in some ways it's a very satisfying, very quick thing to do, except then you had to deal with the new graphics and you had to make it work better for those platforms. I think the most difficult things about porting Karateka, one was Jordan was very exacting. So that probably would be, and because the game in some ways is very ambitious. So there's a lot of assets and you had to keep motion smooth a certain way, and the interactions had to be very responsive. I think actually the Commodore 64 itself was a real chore, because the Commodore 64 wasn't as refined, it was much more complex in terms of what it could do than an Apple II, and that had been the previously most complex computer I'd ever worked with. And it wasn't quite as refined as the Atari in terms of how the hardware would function. And so I found very often it would do things that were not totally predictable. And a lot of people had frustration with it. I think part of it is because the engineering of the Commodore 64 wasn't quite as good. So it was a frustrating platform to work on. And I think the reason why people worked on it is because it was so incredibly popular, because it was so cheap. It was a $100 computer that did an amazing amount of things. But that to me was the most challenging. So the Commodore 64 had only one button. So for punch and kick, which was on the Apple, you had two different buttons, so you could do punch and kick separately. On the Commodore 64, we had only one button. And I believe it was Jordan who came up with the idea of a short press to do a punch and a long press to do a kick. I kind of have that memory. And it seems like Jordan to come up with that. And ultimately would have to pass muster with Jordan anyway. You're trying to fit, it's not exactly a square peg into a round hole, but there are certain design compromises. And very often you have to reinterpret intent. Fortunately, Jordan was around. But it's like if you translate a book into a different language, you don't do a literal translation. There are places where language will accommodate it. So you have to kind of reshape it through the sort of artistic intent. And this was one of those compromises. I remember the music in Karateka was very important, particularly because Jordan was very much into music and the cinematic quality of it. And his dad was as well. His dad composed the music, and his dad is actually quite an accomplished composer. And on the Apple II, it didn't have the audio capability. It was single voice, and you had to kind of simulate through square wave stuff, try to modulate it. But on the Commodore version, he made them much richer. And so the music was, I believe, largely recomposed for the platform. I think the same theme that played at the beginning of the game was part of it, but he filled it out all over the place. And Jordan's father, Francis, went to town on it. He composed the whole thing himself. And so I'd get these bulk shipments of notes that I'd have to figure out. And there were more cues put into where the sound would happen. It was a challenge on the Commodore 64 because it ran slower to we couldn't get the same fluidity as the Apple. We could actually do better than that on the Atari, and that just turns out because the Atari hardware worked a certain way. So the Atari 400-800 port came after the Commodore 64 port. It was a pleasure to use. It had the same one-button joystick problem, and its audio output wasn't quite as rich and interesting as the Commodore, but it was a faster processor. Now the Atari would steal DMA cycles to draw the screen, but because Karateka had a big blue sky, you would use these scanline interrupts to change the graphics mode. So like at the top of the screen, I would switch it to low-res graphics, which were basically like big text, and just set them to big blue blocks. And it would render that, and then when I got down to the fence, turn it off, and then it would go into high-res mode. And so what that did is it probably ran at like 1.4 megahertz, so it's probably 40% faster, so it could be smoother. So in the Apple version, it would go fast and slow depending on how many things were rendering on the screen. But on the Atari, it was more likely to be at the right speed and feel more fluid, like as things were, like big objects were scrolling by. And in the dark rooms, in the later levels, you just turn off the entire graphics stuff, so it was particularly efficient. You didn't have to render anything up there, so it ran much closer to probably 1.6. And so the upshot was that it just felt better on the Atari. And I don't know, there's been many ports since. I remember seeing the IBM PC port of it, and it wasn't anywhere near as fluid. I did these conversions, and I was friends with Jordan at the very start of my career. I was a teenager at the time. And so in terms of how this fits into history, I feel a lot of pride in that this, I think, was a very significant work that changed the course of how people think about computer games. But also for me personally, it changed my relationship with Jordan, and how I think about crafting things changed dramatically as well.
Yeah, it was pretty hard. Started out, you got to master kind of the upper hit, the lower hit, and then the bird comes along and kills you, and you're like, oh, wait a minute. I have to get good at that. I have to get good at the timing, right? The way the game unfolded those sorts of vulnerabilities and effectively rewound you, right? Like, making a mistake was a big impact.
Well, that was the hardest thing to learn in the game. He just sends his eagle, hawk, falcon, whatever. Like we just knew it was trouble, and finally learning like the timing of how to like kick it in the air or something like that, and keep sending it back and just get it to go away.
Yes, yeah, I remember trying to time it. Well, it was difficult at first, but games back then, I was an arcade rat, so I was used to, you try something, it doesn't work, you die, you start over, you try again, try something different. And Karateka was, more of that.
It was a very memorable sense of progress. Like, I've got to get through this guy again. I know what to do here. It's like, oh, you sent the bird. Okay, I'll get ready to kick it.
Today game design is more forgiving about that stuff, but back then it really wasn't. So you had to really memorize, right about here is when you're going to get attacked by the eagle. Right about here is when you're going to start encountering the next tier of enemy.
You gotta make sure that you get through the gates safely and they don't like crush your skull. I don't know how many times that happened, but it was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot harder, I think, than games today. I would actually say in some ways it was a little more forgiving than a lot of games back then, because you didn't insta-die in one hit from most enemies. Right? The eagle was the one who most likely to kill you for quite a while. A lot of games back then were super punitive, right? Very, very challenging. And it felt to me like Karateka, because it wanted you to feel immersed in the movie, gave you a little bit of rope, right? Not a ton.
To me, the magic of games of that era was exactly that they gave you just what you needed. And then as a player, you kind of filled in the blanks, like you used your imagination. And that had a big impact on me, with Karateka. And that's something I carried with me, into Mortal Kombat, was exactly that. It's like, hey, this is an arcade game. There's not a whole lot of place to tell stories. So we better take every advantage that we can, to kind of set these things up so that the player has the tools that they need to kind of fill in blanks.
You really felt the beats of the story and the beats of the action as you march through the game. And I mean, there's so many like cool things, the cinematic scrolling, so you have like a mountain in the background and, the gates you're getting through. And
like, I think about just the sky in that game as something that, it served almost as a character, because the way the backgrounds framed you was very intentional feeling. It wasn't just random tree every, fixed distance, right? Which again is what most of those games would have done. Tree, screen, tree, screen, tree, right? Instead, you had a real sense of framing to it. It felt like still shots or photo shots.
And so you got a sense of you being like the protagonist, but like the antagonists are approaching you, and it takes a little while to get to them. And that cross-cutting technique just gives you a sense of tension that builds and builds and builds, and then you're facing them like, it's super effective. And it was like, again, another shocking choice to sort of use the language of cinema to convey like approach. That's like a simple thing, but it's a really powerful thing.
You had to, gosh, I'm flashing back now. You had to pay attention to where that guy was, because if it cut away to the enemy and he was coming at you from one direction, you're moving in that direction. If you kept going full tilt, odds were pretty good you'd slam right into him and get in trouble. So you actually had to remember, oh wait, he's coming. I'm going to want to slow down and give him a chance to kind of mosey in when we get close enough, right? Just to have a better tactical position. So it wasn't just that we cut away for story. It actually cued important gameplay things and gave you an opportunity to strategize a little. You really had to think about that, and it was very much a learn by failing kind of process, which of course leads all the way up to the ending, which has one of the biggest twists that way ever.
Let me tell you the story of the entire Apple II gaming community hating Jordan Mechner.
The way the game worked is you essentially could be in combat stance or not. And you did move in and out of combat stance pretty regularly because you wanted to be able to sprint versus, edge forward.
Finally, I have killed the boss. You run into the room and there's a princess there.
So, of course, what we did was we edged in and we got close and wham. She killed us because she thought we were one of the villains.
As frustrating as that was for me the first time I got kicked in the face by her, the chance to kind of do it all over again and figure out, okay, what did I do wrong?
If you come in a non-aggressive way, it's very different.
So you have to play the whole thing again and then walk up to her. And then she's cool, thanks for saving me and all that stuff. But the moment of shock on my face when like I was just taken out with one hit is like, whoosh, it's like, what?
Today we'd call it a cutscene, but it's a seamless one. You were in control, and then suddenly the game takes over and you're not in control, and it's perfectly seamless. If anything, my one regret with the game was always that I wanted there to be a little bit more right after that final hug. It goes pretty quickly sort of into rolling the end, and I always wish there were a little more, that the story didn't just stop.
It really affected me as far as, like how much of a sort of a feeling of a story experience you could have in a game, and like you could feel emotions, even, being mad that something happened in the game. Like all those were like, everything was just kind of fun. And so like that led me to love like character-based games and story. I think it's one of the foundational experiences that made me want to make, you know, an Acronox, an epic RPG, or made me want to like feature more more bold characters and more story content in games, just because it was like, it felt like a new thing and a new way to tell stories.
Yeah!